right. Hello and officially welcome to Solar Alberta's 2022 seminar series. Today's webinar is called Participating in the Carbon Market, Solar Offsets for Homes and Businesses. My name is Heather McKenzie and I'm the Executive Director of Solar Alberta. I'd like to take a minute to acknowledge that I am presenting to you today from Amiskwaci, Waskahigan, also known as Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, which is located on Treaty 6 territory and the homelands of the Métis Nation. Treaty 6 territory is the traditional gathering place and home of many Indigenous peoples, including the Papachase, Cree, Saulteaux, Dene, Blackfoot, and Nakota Sioux, nations whose ancestors have cared for and nurtured these lands since time immemorial. We were delighted to have so many people register for this event, I think over 200, so I'm sure they'll continue filtering in here as we get underway. Please note that we will be recording this webinar for future distribution. Today, we'll be hearing from two informative speakers about how solar offsets fit into the broader carbon market in Alberta, and how Albertan home and business owners considering solar arrays can participate directly in the carbon market and accelerate their payback period. Following the presentation, there will be a Q&A period in which you can all participate. The formal Q&A will run until about 1/4 the hour, and then we will be inviting you to join us for an additional bonus 15 minutes in a more relaxed Zoom meeting Q&A format at the end. The link for the extended Q&A will be posted in the chat at the end of the formal Q&A. I will draw your attention to it at that time, so you need not worry, but do make sure to click on that link before leaving the webinar. The entire session will wrap up in an hour and a half. In an effort to increase accessibility to the content we're offering, we have enabled closed captioning for this presentation. You can turn the captioning on in the toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom screen. During our formal Q&A period, we will be using Zoom Q&A for questions rather than the chat box. So please enter your questions in the Q&A section. Also, please click on the little thumbs up symbol to upvote questions that you like. Before we move forward, we're going to do a quick poll to get a sense of who we have joining us today. So please take a minute to complete that poll and answer the question popping up on your screen now. And while some are still doing the poll, I encourage you to also take a minute and pop your name, land acknowledgement, and any contact info you're comfortable sharing in the chat now and throughout the event. That way others can look you up on LinkedIn or email you, and hopefully some relationships can begin to be formed. I know at our last seminar, we're really delighted to see some of our members were developing various subcontracting relationships through the process and all that jazz. So it was quite neat to see. All right, we are viewing the poll results. So looks like we've got a lot of solar curious folks in the house today. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. I had a feeling that might happen since this whole offset conversation is fairly new to many of us. And then, of course, our regular solar industry professionals. We know many of you are our members and we appreciate you joining us today, and some students here as well. So thank you very much for that. It is always helpful to know a little bit about who's in the room, the virtual room. And now I'm just going to share briefly about Solar Alberta before I turn the mics over. Solar Alberta is in our 31st year of operation. We are a not-for-profit society that is dedicated to accelerating Alberta's transition to a just and sustainable energy future. We do so by advocating, by educating, and by serving as an industry and community hub for solar energy. Our membership is made up of over 350 individuals and businesses. We provide a number of services, including managing a solar directory through our website. In this way, we act as a bridge for installers, suppliers, and recently offset providers to connect with their customers and clients. You can see a screenshot of the directory here on this slide. In addition to our website services, we run a number of educational programs such as this solar seminar series on a number of Thursdays over the lunch hour throughout the year. As well, we also run new multilingual Solar 101 workshops. We host an annual online conference and trade show that many of you may have tuned in for, called the Solar Show. And we're really proud to share that in 2022, our Solar Show reached over 600 people, attendees, individual attendees. It was amazing. Recordings of 2021 and the 2022 Solar Show sessions can be found on our website, solaralberta.ca, or our YouTube channel. The 2021 recordings actually include a keynote address from one of our speakers today, Dr. Sara Hastings-Simon. So if you like what she's saying today and want to hear more from her, there's lots more on our website. And any of you between the ages of 18 to 29 should be aware that next Thursday, we are hosting a young adult mentoring event online in partnership with Relay Education. So to register, you can follow the link that's being placed in the chat. Also, stay tuned for the Young Adult Solar Site Tour. It's going to be in person. We're hosting it with Relay as well in Edmonton later this month. And our next Thursday lunch hour seminar will be on July 21st. You're going to be hearing from yours truly, as well as our board member, Nicholas Kwan Wong, about how to ensure homes and businesses are built or renovated in a solar-ready way. Stay tuned to our social media and newsletters to learn more about our upcoming events. And as I mentioned, archive videos are on our YouTube channel and on our website. This spring, we just completed a great round of online courses for solar industry professionals or those transitioning into the sector. If you weren't able to attend the live classes this spring, fear not, we now have a pay per download service available. You can purchase pre-recorded courses and workshops very affordably on our website. We have another round of classes starting live online in October. If you're not already, I just want to give a quick plug and encourage you to become a Solar Alberta member. We are constantly evolving our member service offerings, some of which you can see listed on the screen. Individual membership is just $35 and you can purchase that at solaralberta.ca. If you are looking for an additional way to support the work that Solar Alberta is doing, you could consider volunteering or donating. Volunteer opportunities consist of helping with communications, public education, advocacy, and much more. Volunteers are also eligible for free membership with Solar Alberta after committing 15 hours and are also eligible for $100 off of a course each year. And with that said, I want to take this opportunity to give a big shout out to Solar Offset for sponsoring today's seminar. Thank you very much for that. We're really happy to have you here today as a sponsor. Always interested in developing more partnerships for our events. So if you or your company want to work with us to educate the public about solar or solar related technologies and opportunities, please don't hesitate to reach out. And now I'm going to introduce today's speakers. Dr. Sara Hastings-Simon is an assistant professor in the Department of Physics and Astronomy and School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary, where she directs the Masters of Science in Sustainable Energy Development. She is a macro energy system researcher, and her work is focused on understanding how low carbon energy transitions happen within different sectors of the economy and how policy responses can improve outcomes. Sara is co-founder and co-host of Energy versus Climate, a webinar and podcast that explores the energy transition in Alberta, which is my primary professional development source. So thank you, Sara, for that. And of course, they also explore topics in Canada and beyond. She's also the chair of the panel for Clean Growth with the Canadian Climate Choices Institute and a member of the board of directors of Emissions Reduction Alberta, as well as the Pembina Institute. Dr. Sara Hastings-Simon holds a PhD in physics from the University of Geneva, but I did ask her to lay it out simply for us today, so don't be intimidated by her title. She is a very strong communicator despite that intimidating degree. Thanks, Sara. Okay, next up, we're going to have our second speaker will be Graham Harris. And hi, Graham. Graham is the project lead for Solar Offset. He has been working as greenhouse gas quantifier and verifier in Alberta's carbon markets since they were first established in 2007. So while offsets are new to many of us here today, they're certainly not new to Graham. And he set up Firefly GHG Consulting in 2016. His previous employment includes being the VP Technical Services at Blue Source Canada and Regional Discipline Lead of Carbon Services for Stantec Consulting. Graham has an MSc in Energy and Sustainable Building Design and a BSc in Environmental Management. He is certified as an environmental professional with a specialization in greenhouse gas quantification with Eco Canada. And now I'm very pleased to welcome you both, and I'm going to turn the mic and the screen share over to Dr. Sara Hastings-Simon to begin her presentation, and then she'll turn it over to Graham from there. So welcome, Sara.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me today. Let me get my screen share set up because I can't talk and do two things at the same time. All right. So I just want to start by acknowledging that I'm joining you from the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta. And I'm joining you from the city of Calgary, which is also home to the Métis Nation Region 3. And I was really interested when Heather and the team asked if I would give this presentation to think more about, what exactly are the implications of solar offsets and how to really think about explaining what exactly offsets and environmental attributes are. And so what I thought I would do today as sort of a lead into Graham's presentation is try to give a bit more of an understanding of what environmental attributes are, what offsets are, and how they work sort of generally within the Alberta system. And what that might mean if you're considering selling offsets from a solar system. And then Graham will be able to walk through more of the details of how you actually do this in a practical sense in Alberta. So to start with, some language or some kind of tools that are important to understand as part of this conversation. And one of the key ones is really this idea of an environmental attribute. And I actually have a hard time. I don't have a great analogy. I even went to Twitter to ask people sort of, what's a good analogy for what an environmental attribute is? Because it's kind of this like squishy thing that's sort of hard to define. What it is in a practical sense is really like a bookkeeping tool that tracks the positive environmental impacts of a project. So, whether it's installing solar or switching from a gas-powered car to an electric car, an electric bike, you can have different actions that create some kind of positive environmental benefit. And there's different types of benefits that can be a reduction in carbon emissions. It can also be a reduction in other kinds of pollution. It can be, have some kind of positive impact on water or land. So there's a lot of different dimensions, but it's the idea that there's a way to sort of capture and keep track and really sort of quantify and track that positive impact. And the closest one I got as a good example of sort of something that we're maybe more used to, or at least have heard of, is the idea of a certificate of authenticity that might come with some kind of, I don't know, piece of art or something. I've never bought art that has this, but I understand that if you buy a piece of art that is made by, say, a famous painter, it would come with a certificate of authenticity. And the idea is that certificate, it's not a perfect analogy, but I do sort of like it in that once that certificate goes to something else, then that piece of art that you have might be considered for practical purposes no longer actually authentic. And so that's sort of maybe one way to think about an environmental attribute, although it's even a bit stronger because, of course, that piece of art might still have been made by that person. And in this case, that environmental attribute's really somewhere else. But the idea is really you kind of try to avoid double counting and making sure that you're keeping track of what happens to that. And the two types of environmental attributes that are most relevant when we talk about electricity and about solar in particular are renewable energy certificates, sometimes abbreviated as RECs, and carbon credits. And so RECs actually, in some sense, they come about a little bit because of a legislative history in the US and some of the policies there that were created to incentivize renewable energy. And so a REC is sort of funny as an environmental attribute because it actually tracks the renewableness of the electricity. It doesn't necessarily exactly track the say carbon emissions or something, whereas a carbon credit, more directly really tracks, okay, when you install this solar panel or this solar panel system, this is the emissions reductions that you're getting in exchange. But I think the important thing to kind of take away from this is that an environmental attribute in general, and we'll be talking more about carbon credits today, is really something that is, a tool to be able to measure, to quantify, and then to be able to keep track of some kind of positive impact that a project is making. And obviously today, we'll be talking about carbon offsets. And so we'll be talking specifically about the positive carbon impact, but there's other impacts that even a solar system might have if it's displacing, say, combustion from coal or natural gas. There may be air pollution benefits that aren't tracked as part of the system. So with that in mind, I mentioned we'll focus on this carbon offset piece, and that's kind of the environmental attribute that is most relevant for the discussion here today. And so that's really the avoided carbon emissions that come because of the renewable energy generation. So instead of, if you build a solar PV system on a rooftop or on a farm, and that's generating a kilowatt hour of electricity, that's a kilowatt hour of electricity that didn't have to come from the marginal producer in Alberta, which would be, a coal or natural gas plant, depending on the time of day. And that leads to some amount of emission reductions. So an offset more generally, and the idea of offsets is really that they represent some kind of reduction in emission that comes from another activity. And so the concept behind sort of creating an offset system and allowing people to sell offsets is that you could have some sort of activity that's not covered under environmental legislation that would be good if it happened, but there's no sort of legislation to encourage that. And then over here, you have some other reason that you want to achieve that. And so an offset sort of allows you to pull parts of your economy or parts of the global economy into whatever kind of, either legislated or voluntary plan that you have. And when we think about offsets, there's a few things that sort of make offsets, I don't want to say good or bad, but, better or worse or higher quality. And a couple of the characteristics that I would want to focus on today is this idea of additionality and leakage, as well as permanence. And so additionality is really a fancy word for saying that your offset actually adds to something, as opposed to just sort of leaving the system in the way that it always has been. And so what that means is that when you're thinking about offsets and really being able to track the impact of offsets, you're always trying to compare what's happening in this world that we live in, where you've installed the solar and generated an offset and sold that offset, to the imaginary world where you weren't able to sell that offset. And the idea of additionality is this question of what would have happened if you hadn't sold that offset. Is this activity really additional? Is it really different from that other world that we're trying to measure? And now that's obviously tricky because, we can't, as a scientist, you can't run a scientific experiment, right? Where we have the world where we have these offsets and then don't, and then compare them and pay people for them. So we have to do our best to estimate, what would have happened otherwise. And there are offsets that are better and worse sort of against that measure. So certainly if you have, say, a practice within the farming sector, to take one example that comes up often, if you have a practice in the farming sector that reduces emissions because of how you're treating the land or something like that, you really need to think about would that thing, is that a common practice? Is that the typical way of doing things? And so you wouldn't want to create offsets in a case where the typical way of doing things is reducing emissions. That wouldn't really be an offset that's additional, because you're basically saying, well, look, this would have happened otherwise. And the question of leakage is sort of similar. So if you have an offset, say, that represents saving a piece of forest. So you have a piece of forest and you say, I'm going to create an offset and I'm going to pay somebody not to cut down that piece of forest. First, you need to know, were they actually going to cut it down if you hadn't paid them? And then the next question is, well, now that you've paid them, what happens? If their forest is like this and you paid them not to cut down this piece of land forest, and now they just go and cut down these pieces of trees, that's obviously, not your offset is sort of leading to leakage, or it's not additional. So you may have paid for this offset, but you didn't actually get emissions reductions. Another dimension that's important for offsets is the idea of permanence. That is the question of, okay, you can pay for some action to happen, and is that going to stick around for a long time? And again, there's a difference, not to pick on the sort of natural based offset system, but that's another good example where, if you're paying for forests to be preserved, how long is that going to happen for? You know, what happens if a fire comes along, or if some kind of disease or pests or bugs come along and really destroy those trees, and then it's not very permanent. And so when I think about a solar or an electricity, renewable electricity in general, you know, the permanence offsets based on solar score pretty well on that sense. You know, you probably, once you build your solar system, you're going to keep it there and it's going to continue to operate. There's not a big risk that for some reason it's going to go away. The bigger question is really one on additionality. So, you know, would somebody have built this solar in the absence of offsets or not? And again, you know, we can't really know that for sure, but that's something to think about when you're considering offsets in your own case. Just a couple other kind of things to mention as far as offsets. So they can be used in either voluntary or compliance markets. And so obviously we have a compliance market in Alberta because we do have a carbon pricing system. And so that's really a compliance market is one where there is that legislation there, and the offset is going to be used to meet some law or some legislated requirement. There's also, you know, quite a robust voluntary offset market that exists in different jurisdictions. And that comes in all sort of different types. So you might have companies that have their own internal targets. So a corporation says we're going to, you know, reduce our emissions by so and so much, not because anybody is forcing us to, but, you know, because we think it makes business sense for us to do that. You probably have run into times where you've been offered, you know, to offset your emissions for a purchase online or for a flight or something like that. And that would be another example of a voluntary market. So, you know, just these are things that are good to sort of understand and think about when you're considering offset sales, that you understand where that market is going. And then the last observation that I'll make is really just that the role for offsets is going to decrease over time on the pathway to net zero, right? And so offsets can be a really useful tool. Basically, if we think that there is some opportunity out there that for whatever reason it's not happening, and we're working in, you know, the rest of the economy to reduce emissions, and we'd like to target those as well. Now, if you fast forward to 2050, when, you know, hopefully we're living in a net zero world, what that means is basically we've had to take all of those actions, everything. We had to do all the things that we're granting offsets for, plus all of the other emissions that we're trying to offset. And so in some sense, once you're at a net zero world, and the net throws a few wrenches in it, but I think it's fair to say, you know, sort of simplification overall, that once you're in that net zero world, then there is no longer a role for offsets. And we really need to be pursuing all of those emission reductions. So now, hopefully that gives you a bit of an understanding of, you know, what's an environmental attribute, what's an offset. Now I wanted to share a little bit about what the Alberta industrial carbon pricing system is, and then finally tie that all together of what that means for, you know, thinking about selling solar offset. So TIER, which is the carbon pricing system that currently operates for industrial emitters in Alberta, is a compliance system, right? So there's a law, there's carbon pricing is the law of the land, both in Canada and at an industrial level within Alberta. And what the industrial system does basically is that it applies the carbon price to large industrial emitters, but then it gives them an extra two extra compliance options compared to what consumers and smaller businesses face. So if you look at the list and you think about your own emissions, you know, that you're paying on when you're filling up your car with gasoline or getting natural gas in your home, there are sort of two ways that you can comply. You can either directly reduce your emissions, and whatever you reduce your emissions, you don't pay, or there's that last one on the list, you can pay the carbon price on emissions. And so the concept of this industrial carbon pricing system is to try to address a case of carbon leakage, where if there's too much carbon cost applied to industry in Alberta, it might end up going somewhere else that doesn't have a carbon pricing system. There's a whole discussion to have about that. Probably doesn't fit under Solar Alberta's mandate, but that's something else worth learning more about if you're interested in industrial carbon pricing. But for today's purposes, there's two other compliance mechanisms that industrial users have under carbon pricing under TIER. And so one is basically these emissions performance credits. And these are credits that are given for free to industrial emitters on the basis of how much of something they're producing and some kind of production or sector or facility benchmark. And so in the case of the electricity sector, all electricity producers in Alberta get emissions performance credits at a level of 370 tons per megawatt hour. Don't quote me on that. I think I have those units matched up rightly. But basically, it's saying that they don't pay on the first portion of the emissions that they create. And if they are emitting less than that, they can sell those EPCs, and so that sort of exists. So when you hear about emissions performance credits, that's what they are. Also not as relevant for kind of selling those offsets, but that's one mechanism. Now, the one that's particularly relevant for today is the fourth compliant mechanism, which is listed as the third here, which is offsets from approved offset protocols. And so basically, that's another option that industrial emitters have for meeting their carbon compliance. They can purchase or generate themselves these offsets and use those in place of either reducing their own emissions or paying the carbon price on emissions. Typically, people are going to use the EPCs they have at least over a certain amount of time, but that's sort of the other option. And so when you think about generating offsets and selling them, that's eventually where they go, is that they're sold to a large industrial emitter who ends up using them as one mechanism for emissions reduction. And I know Graham will talk more about how that works in practice, but that's sort of the high level concept of what's happening there. So what does that all really mean when you're thinking about, okay, do I want to sell offsets or not? I think one question is, going back, let me just skip back here. So one question is really to say, okay, how comfortable are you with the offset protocol that's used for the electricity sector in Alberta, right? And does that creating high quality offsets that are really good from the perspective of whether or not they are additional and the permanence. It's understanding that in this case, it's mostly being used in the compliance market. And then what are the implications of selling those options, and what are the other things that you could do with them? And so in some sense, you have really two options for what you can do with your offsets and with your environmental attributes. So no matter what you do, whether you go and have offsets certified or not, you can think about a solar PV system that you install as generating an environmental attribute for every kilowatt hour of electricity that it generates. It is by definition going to be creating this environmental attribute. Now, you can register those in an official way within an offset system or not, but they do exist even, at least conceptually, even if you don't register them. And so then the question is, what do you do with them? And you really have sort of basically two options. One is that you can keep them and can explain a little bit more about what that means. And the other one is that you can sell them. And neither of these is, there's no right or wrong answer here, right? This is not a true false question. It's really a question of what are your goals, and understanding then, given your goal, what is the right thing to do. And so if you keep your environmental attribute, in this case, that really means just doing nothing, right? Like in some cases, if you were a company and you were trying to show a voluntary compliance, you might go get that registered, and then you would so-called, people sometimes talk about retiring them or putting them in a drawer, but basically you would just, sit in your home or your farm or your business knowing that you're not using those offsets. And so that's a really good thing to do if your sort of main motivation or a big thing that you want to achieve by installing a solar system is actually to have the biggest impact on reducing carbon emissions, because it basically means that you own those carbon emissions reductions and nobody can use them to offset other emission reductions. The other option is to have that environmental attribute quantified and sold. And that's a really good option if you're looking basically, you don't care as much, at least about the total carbon emission reduction. And it's not an all or nothing, you can sell offsets for part of the time. But for the time that you're selling those offsets, you're not having, a direct impact on emissions reductions. You're selling those on, somebody else owns that emissions reductions and can take credit for that. But it's really good if your goal is to shorten your payback period. In theory, you could also, create cash flow out of that you want to use for other uses. So you could try to create your own, internal offset system where you say, well, if I don't sell these, I won't have the money to go buy an e-bike. And so I'm going to sell them and buy an e-bike that I wouldn't have bought otherwise. Because it is at this point, we're not talking about the compliance market, but really your own voluntary actions, you again can sort of do what you want there. And then in both cases, you are certainly, self-generating and helping to grow the solar industry in general. And so that is, I think, the really the key when you think about what's the right action for you when it comes to your offsets is, if it's really your goal in having a solar system is to make the biggest impact on emissions reductions, then that probably means that you want to hang on to those offsets. Certainly, you also want to think about the additionality. So if you would have installed your solar anyway, even if you weren't able to generate and sell these offsets, then, it would also put you more towards the left of this curve that, those offsets aren't really going to lead to additional emissions reductions. And so selling them is, you might question that for yourself. However, if your goal is really more around, self-generation, locking in lower prices and shortening your payback period, then it would make a lot of sense for you to be selling offsets in that case. So I think I will wrap up there just with a couple of links if you want to learn more about our master's program or energy versus climate, where we talk at length about offsets and solars and things like that. But I look forward to the questions. And I think with that, I will hand the virtual pointer over to Graham, who can tell us more about how to actually generate those offsets, get us out of the theory sky that I've put us in.
Great, thank you very much, Sarah. Let me just share my screen. I'll wait for yours to, I guess, to pop off first, Sarah.
Stop share. Okay.
Great. Okay, hopefully everyone can now see my screen. So thanks, Sarah. That was a very informative talk. Some great information, great perspectives in there. And thanks also to Solar Alberta for organizing this session. My name is Graham Harris. So I'm the owner, as Heather said, I'm the owner of Firefly GHG Consulting. I'm also the co-founder of Solar Offset. We're a carbon offset aggregator. We exist basically to help owners of small-scale solar and wind power systems get an additional passive income stream from their systems. I'm excited to be here talking to you today about how Alberta's carbon markets work and can work for the average Albertan to make these systems more affordable. It's something I'm pretty passionate about. I think this is a key tool to accelerate the energy transition in our province. And the photo on the screen that you're looking at right now is actually half of the PV system that we had installed at our home in late 2020. We've got an 8 kilowatt system. There's 14 panels you see there on the garage roof. I've got another 10 panels on the roof of my home in Calgary. So this is something near and dear to me. I've been working in the Alberta carbon markets since 2007, since they were first established. And I've been involved in lots and lots of projects. I've quantified projects, I've verified projects. I've been involved in writing protocols. I've been an expert reviewer for Emission Reduction Alberta. I've been around for a long time doing this stuff, but despite all this knowledge and experience that I have, professionally, there's still no way for me as a owner of a PV system to actually create offset credits if I want to do that. I just cannot do that on my own because the economics just don't stack up for the owner of a small scale microgeneration system. There is a way to do this, however, by owners all working together. And that's really what I'm here to kind of talk to you all about today. So I'll be walking you all through how the market in Alberta works, what is required to create offset credits, and how much they're potentially worth. So the carbon market in Alberta is well established. Sarah's already talked about the fact that there's 3 different kind of compliance mechanisms: fund credits, emission performance credits, and offset credits. In any of these cases, 1 credit is equal to 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions reductions. And so what we're going to be talking about today is how you as an owner or a prospective owner of a small scale system can actually participate in this market and generate offset credits. So there's a few things you need in order to be able to generate offset credits from any activity in Alberta. A project must result in measurable greenhouse gas emission reductions from voluntary activities and must follow a government-approved protocol. There is a government-approved protocol for distributed renewable electricity systems. A protocol is basically a methodology document that prescribes the eligibility criteria for a specific kind of project, as well as its data collection, storage, and calculation requirements. The project must also then be independently verified by a third party to international standards in a process that's called verification. So it's like an audit process, basically. A project would then be able to create credits for typically either an 8-year term or a 10-year term. Projects that opt to create credits for an 8-year term may or may not then be also eligible for a 5-year extension for a total of 13 years. In either way, this is called the crediting period. And this is basically the total length of time that any project is allowed to create offset credits. So a minimum of 8, a maximum of 13. So assuming that you then have a voluntary greenhouse gas emission reduction project and a valid protocol, you can proceed to create offset credits following a cyclical process. This starts with the creation of what's called an offset project plan. This is registered with the Alberta Emission Offset Registry and basically details everything about that project: where it is, what information is going to be collected, how the emission reductions are going to be calculated, etc. At this point, then the clock will start ticking on the crediting period for that project. So that 8 years or 10-year term will start when the offset project plan is registered with the Alberta Emission Offset Registry. At that point, then, you can start to create the offset credits following this cycle of data collection, quantification, producing what's called an offset project report, undergoing that third-party verification, and registering, serializing, and selling those credits. And then that cycle will begin again. And that's typically done on an annual basis. So this market has resulted in over 75 million offset credits being created since 2007. And as you can see here from the graph on the right-hand side, slightly over 15 million of those, so 20% of those credits, have come from utility scale wind farms. So these are the kind of large wind farms that you see down mainly in the southern part of our province. By comparison, only 0.01% of these credits have come from microgeneration systems. Why is that? Well, to understand this, we need to understand really how renewable electricity systems create offset credits. So Sarah talked about this at a high level. And the principle is a simple one. Renewable electricity offset credits are based upon displacing the emissions from the electricity grid. So in other words, whatever energy is generated by the solar panels does not then need to be generated by the grid. And most of the grid here in Alberta is gas, and then we've also still got a proportion of generation from coal. This graph that you see here shows data from Canada's National Inventory Report. It illustrates the change in emissions intensity of electricity in the province over the last 20 years. So Alberta still has an emissions intensive grid, but as you can see, it has been steadily getting cleaner as we've got more gas and more renewables replacing coal generation. And the coal generation fleet in Alberta is expected to be fully transitioned out to gas by the end of next year. And we also have a large number of utility scale solar farms and newer wind farms also still in the process of being developed. So we expect this process of greening of Alberta's grid to continue into the future. Based on this emissions intensity of the grid, the provincial government then calculates a factor called the grid displacement factor, or the GDF. The chart here that we're looking at shows that the GDF from 2015 to 2019 was 0.64 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per megawatt hour. In 2019, then it was adjusted to its current level of 0.57. And for 2023 onwards, it's expected the GDF will be down at 0.55. This is currently in draft form. The new grid displacement factor is based upon 2018 to 2020 grid data, so it doesn't yet reflect that full transition away from coal generation. So for 2025 onwards, we're expecting that grid displacement factor to be even lower still. So why does this matter? Well, quite simply, this grid displacement factor can be thought of as like an exchange rate. It's the rate at which your electricity, your clean electricity, is converted into offset credits. And it's fixed for the crediting period of a particular project. So this means that as the grid greens and the GDF drops, the later an offset project starts, the lower the rate at which it will be allowed to claim offset credits. So, understanding what the current GDF is and why that's important for creating offset credits, let's consider how many offsets a solar PV system in Alberta can actually generate. So the map here, courtesy of energyhub.org, shows the solar installation level in Alberta. And you can see, obviously, and for those of you who like me may be a bit colorblind, I'll just explain this. The darker areas at the bottom are where we're getting the best solar resource, and then we're going over to these cooler areas in the top where we're getting comparatively less of a solar resource. But Alberta has a very good solar resource, the second best in Canada. Only Saskatchewan has a better kind of solar resource than Alberta as a province. But the average annual value in Alberta is this 1,276 kilowatt hours per kilowatt installed. What this means is that an average system owner in Alberta can expect for every 1 kilowatt of system that they've installed, they're going to get that 1,276 kilowatt hours or 1.276 megawatt hours of electricity from their system. And using that GDF factor, this converts then into just slightly over 0.7 offset credits per year per installed kilowatt. And as you can see then, despite the relatively emissions intense grid in Alberta and our good solar resource, you're still not creating that many offset credits from a typical system, a typical small scale system in Alberta. Even a 1 megawatt system still only creating 700 offsets a year. And bear in mind that we've had 75 million offset credits created in the market to date. That's not very much. So this then brings me to the topic of aggregation and why that's needed and important for small system owners to participate in a carbon market. So to understand this concept of aggregation and why it is important, let's firstly consider the scenario of a utility scale solar farm. So this farm's got lots of panels, but it's only got 1 meter. It's therefore generating a lot of clean energy, but it's not generating that much data. So relatively speaking, therefore, claiming offset credits for a project such as this generates a lot of benefits for not very much cost. And a large project such as this can therefore proceed with creating carbon offsets all by itself. By contrast, consider an individual microgeneration system. It's still only got 1 meter, but it's connected to not very many panels at all, right? So again, it doesn't create that much data, but it also doesn't generate much in the way of clean energy either. And what's critical to note is that this microgeneration project has to go through that entire cyclical process in just the same way as that utility scale project does. It has to create an offset project plan. It has to quantify that data. It has to be third-party verified. So all the same steps have to be followed, and they require the same level of effort. So in this case, converting that clean energy into third-party verified offsets actually greatly outweighs the benefits of doing so. And creating offsets in such a case, we typically actually lose the system owner money. By the time they've paid for all those services that are required to take that clean energy and turn it into carbon offsets, there's nothing left. So aggregation is the solution. Like the name suggests, aggregation basically involves gathering data from lots of micro generators and bringing them together, allowing them to be treated as a single project. This allows the project to generate lots of clean energy, but it also means greatly increased data collection and data management among many different stakeholders. So aggregation is therefore much more expensive and complex to administer, but because it allows those costs to be shared by all participants in the aggregation pool, the costs for each individual system owner are greatly reduced to the point at which everyone participating can generate value from their systems. So that's why by working together, the owners of small-scale renewable energy systems can participate in Alberta's carbon market. So who's actually eligible? So to be eligible to join a microgeneration renewable electricity aggregation project in Alberta, you need to meet all of these criteria. So first of all, you need to be the owner of the system. Secondly, you need to be in Alberta. Thirdly, you need to be connected to the grid, right? So you're displacing that grid electricity. It's only currently applicable to solar and or wind installations, and they have to be classed as microgenerators, which means they must be smaller than 5 megawatts or 5,000 kilowatts in size. The protocol that's written by the government also means that it has to have started generating after January 2nd, 2012. And then you also have to have the rights to the offset credit. So this goes back to that whole conversation that Sarah opened up with today about environmental attributes. Okay, so you must have the right to create offset credits. You have not to have essentially given those environmental attributes already to someone or something else. So considering then how that might work, what we need to consider is some of the grants and incentive programs that are there as well. Some of those grant and incentive programs will claim the environmental attributes as a condition of the grant, meaning that you will not be eligible to create offset credits from your system. Others, though, do not make this claim, meaning that you can benefit from the grant program, and if you want to, you can choose to also benefit by selling carbon offsets through an aggregation pool. So the incentives that are on the screen right now, so Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, the Banff Solar PV rebate, Canmore Solar Incentive, the Federal Canada Greener Homes Grant, and the Clean Energy Improvement programs that are in places like Edmonton, Devon, Rocky Mountain House. I believe Leduc's about to launch one, and Calgary's looking at one too. So all of those don't claim your environmental attributes. So you can benefit from this and benefit from a carbon offset. But if you've received one of these programs or grants or incentives that are on the screen right now, then unfortunately you can't also create carbon offsets. These programs have already made claim to your environmental attributes. So Edmonton's solar rebate, the Medicine Hat solar electric incentive, and then any of the kind of provincial programs from Energy Efficiency Alberta, which no longer exists, but obviously there are systems that were funded through it. Emissions Reduction Alberta, and the Municipal Climate Change Action Centre. So those would make you ineligible to participate in creating a carbon offset. So lastly then, just before I kind of sort of summarize things, let's talk about how much carbon credits could be worth. Simply put, the value of an offset credit fluctuates according to supply and demand. This is traded on a marketplace, but it does generally follow quite closely that fund credit price. So as Sarah kind of outlined for us, there's multiple compliance options for these large industries. The simplest of those is to do what's called buying a fund credit, which is basically just paying the government, kind of like paying a self-imposed fine for failing to meet your emission compliance obligations. So they can do that, and the current price to do that is $50 a ton, or they can try and buy an EPC, or they can buy an offset credit. And so obviously no one is paying more than the price of a fund credit to purchase an offset credit. So typically then that price has historically traded in the region of kind of 75 to 95% of the fund credit price, with some peaks and troughs obviously according to what's going on in the marketplace. But that gives you some idea that so the current price on offset credits going to be between that sort of $37 and $47 per ton. And as many of you may have already heard, the federal government announced in March of this year that it is going to increase the carbon price across the country by $15 per ton per year until it reaches $170 a ton by 2030. So this graph kind of illustrates the historic price in Alberta since the market started in 2007, when we initially had a $15 a ton price. It has steadily increased now to its $50 a a ton price. And if the federal government's plans do go ahead, we may see that price increase year over year until it's $170 a ton. Now, I'm not going to tell you that's definitely going to happen because this is politics and this is also the future, so who knows? But it's highly likely that there's going to be that upwards price pressure on the carbon markets. And the Alberta government has to reach equivalency of regulation with whatever happens at the federal level. So it is highly likely that will also then lead to a greatly increased price within the Alberta marketplace too. And then finally, just a thought then, a sort of perspective on offset credits and net zero status. You know, obviously it is entirely true if you choose to create offset credits and sell them on to someone else, then during that period that you are doing that, you cannot claim to be net zero. Someone else has got those emission benefits, not you. But bear in mind, of course, that a solar PV system will typically last 25 to 30 years or more. And you're only going to be able to get an absolute maximum of 13 years of credits, and more likely it's going to be 8 or 10. Then there's a huge chunk of time at which that solar PV system will still be operating, will still be generating clean electricity, and no one else will be claiming the environmental benefits from it. So, you know, in the short term, yes, you'd be giving up that net zero claim, but if your longer term goal involves net zero, then you can sell offsets and still benefit from that and reaching that net zero goal. So offset credits make solar more affordable. They increase the payback period. They're an effective alternative to industry paying the government for non-compliance. They allow homes and businesses to choose to do more good, whether it's an e-bike, as Sarah mentioned, or whether it's looking at putting in an EV charging station or upgrading the insulation in your home. That revenue from carbon offsets can allow you to accelerate your own personal journey to net zero without affecting your long-term goals of reducing your emissions and reaching net zero emissions. So that's it for me. Hopefully that's kind of explained for everybody how homes and businesses can participate in Alberta's carbon markets, why aggregation is an important part of how they do so, and what kind of return you could expect to get. So much more info about all of that on our website, but for now, I'm going to turn things back over to Heather. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham, and thank you, Sarah. I think we'll just have the three of us up now on the view for the Q&A period. Your last comment made me think, Graham, that the worst case scenario would be someone takes their carbon offset sales and buys a flight around the world. So we just really want to discourage that.
Yeah, that's fair, right? Yeah, if you reward yourself with something that's fundamentally not clean, yeah.
Ideally, we reach a place in the carbon market where that is so discouraged that it becomes impossible that anyone would ever make that choice. But sadly, we're not there yet. So that was really helpful. I appreciate that overview. We do have a lot of questions coming into the Q&A. A few are accidentally being popped into the chat, which I'm not going to be referencing much because it's just a little hard to monitor both. So I'll just remind the audience to please put your questions in the Q&A box. And if you need guidance finding that, my staff members are kindly available. You can message the admin in the chat and they'll kind of coach you to find the Q&A box. But I see many are already actively participating in there, and Rocky's question is very popular. So kudos to you, Rocky. I feel like I should give an award for the most popular question. Rocky is one of our most hardcore solar enthusiasts and champions in Edmonton. So here we go. She says, as you talk, do you think there is anything special, such as tools or policies, etc., that can help reverse the old paradigm whereby large-scale stuff is always incentivized? She really wants to see more enabling of community-scale solar, so individuals and real people can benefit more from carbon offsets. Any thoughts on that to share with us today?
Sure, I can, can offer a few thoughts. I mean, so I think there's all kinds of different ways you could do that, right? And there's definitely examples from other jurisdictions. You know, there are a number of states in the U.S. that really have policies that directly target community scale solar, right? And either directly support it with funds or even require a certain percentage of solar to go to community scale. And there's some that also look at sort of even within an individual targeting low income consumers. So I think that's one way to do that is to go after it directly. I think more generally, policies that are thinking more about some of the value of where generation is happen and doing these sort of trickier things of thinking about the value of the generation being close to load and what that impact on the transmission and the distribution system is another way to end up in a similar place. And so there's some interesting work that has been done by Chris Clack at Vibrant Energy, along with others, looking at kind of the value of that more local generation, which is often not included kind of in these very high level pictures of value generation across grids.
Yeah, this really makes me think of, we get a lot of folks lately calling in, they live in apartments, they want to participate. So, community generation is the logical way forward for people who live in apartments. They're never going to have enough space on their roof to offset, even if they can figure out some kind of joint ownership arrangement. So they have to look at alternatives. So it's good to think about some of these policy tools and other incentives at place and the role the offsets can play in that. Anything to add there, Graham?
Yeah, I mean, I guess from my perspective, that's exactly why we have chosen to start a program like we have, right? Is because, if you look back at that graph where I was saying 20% of the emission offsets in the marketplace have been created by utility scale wind farms. So that's exactly it. Those large corporations have been able to take advantage of the carbon market and take advantage of that payment. Whereas if you're a farmer with a single turbine on your land, you've not been able to do that because the economics haven't stacked up. So an aggregation program like that we and others are running, that's exactly kind of the way I look at this. This is part of the way to incentivize that action at an individual and a community scale level, right? Is by allowing people to get in on what has previously been exclusive to large companies, right?
Right. It's like sort of the democratization of the carbon offset space. No, I appreciate that. Andrew Reed here with the City of Edmonton is wondering, does the public generally understand? And I think you touched on this, both of you did, that if you sell your offsets that you generate, for 8 to 13 years, you are no longer reducing your own emissions. If you want your home to be zero emissions during that time, you can't sell your offsets. Like, do you think the public actually fully understands that trade-off that they're making for that period of time? Or is that still something that's largely unknown?
I think it's a great question. Whether people understand it or not, I don't know. I suspect that it probably is probably not for the vast majority of people, because the vast majority of people do not understand carbon offsets at all. So I think it's probably fair to assume most people don't know that. But I think it's also worth bearing in mind that this is not just an issue with carbon offsets. There are many other programs also making a claim to the environmental attributes. So if you get a grant that also makes a claim to the environmental attributes and then install solar panels, can you really claim to be net zero? I'd argue it's no different, right? So there are programs that do that too. So, if I get a grant, am I no longer net zero? Well, I still have a solar panel system. I'm still generating clean electricity. And in the long term, as I say, you're definitely going to be net zero. You're going to be part of that solution. So that's my perspective. One of the things I'd love to hear what Sarah says as well, though, on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, Graham, you're probably closer to the sort of individuals that you talk to be able to say what the general public understands. I mean, it definitely, to me, the whole concept of environmental attributes is one of the trickier things to explain. So I don't think that there's probably not a huge amount of understanding there. And I would say, honestly, in the sort of at the company level, when I think about companies and claims that they're making, I mean, it's really only recently that there started to be more attention paid to, the difference between greenwashing and legitimate claims being made, for example, with offsets in the, we were talking about air travel and the air travel space, right? I think there was just a case brought in the Netherlands against KLM. So I think that's, that probably not a lot of understanding, but I wouldn't like single out the public as being particularly far from everybody on this. I think it really gets to just this general point of these are complex systems, and the accounting gets a bit messy in them.
Yeah, we were receiving a presentation. Some of us were receiving a presentation from the city of Edmonton yesterday on how they do their whole carbon budgeting system, and it's happening. You basically need to understand a whole separate budgeting system, and most of us have trouble understanding regular budget cycles. So adding another layer of cycle on there is a challenge for everybody. But it's interesting at the household level, their understanding, and I think that's part of the motivation for having this webinar today, and is really to make sure we are sort of all getting on the same page about what is happening here. There are emissions being reduced. They're not necessarily being reduced on your roof. They might be being reduced elsewhere. So it's interesting. For me, a lot of it is about the culture piece. And I do get a lot of people calling in now. I would say the majority of people calling in about solar these days are actually not calling in for environmental reasons. They are calling in because they can't afford their utility bills. They have a situation of energy poverty. Energy poverty is real for many families in Alberta today. They are looking to solar and solar offsets as a way out of energy poverty. And so if that is if that's your issue, if your issue isn't, oh, I get to go net zero, which, some of us have the privilege of being able to do, then it's a real choice that folks are making. But yes, it's a very good point that, for 8 to 13 years, they're not going to be able to claim net zero. So I think these are really important conversations that we're having today. I don't want to miss some of these other questions, though. They're really great. So we'll carry on here. This person is wondering, they're interested to hear your thoughts on offsets for energy efficiency projects. Not just solar, but let's talk energy efficiency too. So of course they can essentially offer the same emissions reduction as solar, but we haven't seen nearly as much attention, except as we have lately for solar. And of course, before we've always known wind can. So what's the reason behind this? What are your thoughts? What are the barriers for energy efficiency projects? And why are things going better for solar and wind than the folks who are trying to reduce consumption?
I can offer a perspective on that, which is to say that there have been projects registered in Alberta looking at energy efficiency. Much like with solar and wind, they've tended to be at the larger scale. But I think it's also worth bearing in mind that even a large building is not that large in the grand scheme of things, right? So much like we're talking about here today, the only feasible way to bring forward a lot of energy efficiency projects is through an aggregation model, because even the largest of buildings, as I said, they're consuming some natural gas for heating and consuming some electricity for power, but it pales in comparison to an industrial facility's consumption and footprint, right? So there's certainly an element of that, and then it's also more complicated to quantify energy efficiency reductions than it is to quantify clean energy generation. So it's not to say that this isn't something that will happen in the future, but it's been a combination of the need to aggregate and the complexity of quantifying energy efficiency. That's kind of my 2 cents on that.
So there are protocols in place, though, that
there are protocols for energy efficiency in place as well, absolutely. And some, as I said, some companies have successfully brought forward some projects, but they've been aggregations of very large buildings like hospitals, right? As opposed to people's homes.
Well, a year ago, we had a solar offset conversation where it wasn't yet possible to aggregate under 1 megawatt. And now today we have on the line numerous people who are actively aggregating under 1 megawatt for solar. So maybe in a year's time, one of you will have pivoted, and everyone's frantically writing this down, like, we need to pivot the fastest. So there we go, create a little bit of a rush to the energy efficiency piece. Anything to add on that, Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with everything Graham has said. And I think that to me, it's energy efficiency is a great example of a place where, I just think that there are better policy tools to use to capture those opportunities. We know we need to do much more than we're doing. There are very well-studied barriers to energy efficiency. At the same time, it's a really important, and it's a solution, it's a big part of the solution to energy poverty, as you mentioned too. But I think sometimes we should avoid trying to, and not saying that anyone's doing this, but we should avoid trying to use our one hammer tool to fix all the problems, right? And there, I think having things like utility mandates and driving the aggregation at that level has been proven to be much more effective way of actually capturing energy efficiency at scale.
Yeah, and what I really like is programs that don't force us all to compete against each other. So the new Edmonton's Clean Energy Improvement Program, I don't know if you saw, I mean, it's just pilot at this stage, but you must do at least 3 things. So you cannot just do one thing. And I kind of love that. And I hope that the energy savings in business and others adopt that similar method of having us work together instead of all competing against each other, because they work beautifully together. Your air source heat pump is going to work 100 times better if you combine it with energy efficient upgrades and solar. And so I love it, the idea, and I hope that there are more programs and maybe even protocols that will support sort of that combined approach. So we're not all just trying to compete against each other, and instead we start working together more. I know Solar Alberta is not exclusive. I should mention, you can probably see the wind here. We're not solar exclusive. We love everyone, except maybe, coal. I don't think there's anyone in Alberta who's still on that bandwagon. Not that I've met, at least. Okay, Doug's got a question here. After paying for the service of aggregating and managing the carbon offsets, how much can a homeowner expect to earn? There we go. What are the dollars and cents of this? Maybe on a monthly basis, an annual basis? Graham, you want to go there?
Yeah, I mean, that will depend on a couple of things. It will depend, first of all, upon the model that the aggregator you're working with is choosing to use. So solar offset, we're doing a percentage of market sale price, essentially. So as that market price, we believe it's going to go up over time. As that goes up, the owner will get more and more each year. For that, other service providers are providing a fixed price model. So it really depends upon what model your aggregator is using, as well as what happens to that carbon price in the market. I will say, if people are interested, we have a calculator on our website at solaroffset.ca/calculator. You just need to put in the kilowatts of your system. It'll give you an estimate of what your return could be. So that's one way people can go and look, because I could sit here forever just answering questions about prices otherwise, right?
I was imagining your model, and I was imagining it's like, is Jason Kenney winning? Is Justin Trudeau winning? Who's winning? And based on who wins, then we decide on our model.
Well,
is that your modeling?
Yeah, there's obviously there is a political aspect to this, right? You look at the federal government's plans, and whether you're in favor of our current federal or government or not, it's not the issue here. That is, if they continue to be in power, and if they continue down this road, then the longer that is in place, the stronger the carbon price signal becomes, the harder it becomes for a subsequent government to remove that price signal. On the other hand, if the government were to collapse tomorrow and there was to be another election, who knows what will happen, right? So it is a very difficult question to kind of answer, but we have to look at what that regulated market is. And I think it's also worth reiterating the fact in Alberta, we've had a carbon market since 2007. This has survived multiple changes of government.
That's a very good point.
And it's only got stronger over time, right? So I don't think it's going away anytime soon.
It's not going away. I think you're quite right. I've been saying that to folks as well. Is just like solar has survived many different premiers and it's still going strong. So we're not going away anytime soon, and neither is the carbon market, unless it's incredibly successful and it works itself out of business.
That's right. In which case, we'll all be rejoicing because we achieved our environmental goals many years early. I'll be actually quite happy about that.
We will have saved humanity. So there we go. That'll be the trade-off then. So there we go. So here's another one for Graham. And I'm just seeing, okay, here we go. I might have to, sometimes I try and find some gender balance in our questions. So I'm going to go and pull one of the ladies up to the top next. But first, I'll go with Jared. And so for Graham, what size does aggregation lose? At what size does aggregation lose its attractiveness? And does it make more sense to go in alone? Okay, great question. So at like what point would you say stop aggregating, do your own thing?
Right, yeah, exactly. If you've got essentially, I would say it's kind of once you cross that threshold of no longer being a micro generator, it's probably worth looking at whether it's more cost effective to just do it on your own.
So once you're over 5 megawatts, basically.
Yeah, absolutely, probably. But and it's also worth noting that you cross into a different protocol then as well. So it becomes a lot. Even if you wanted to pull in a 5.5 megawatt system into an aggregation pool, it would become considerably more complicated because now you'd be forced to deal with two protocols and you need special permission to do that from Alberta environment. So I'd say essentially up to that point, though, it's probably always going to be worth looking at aggregation as giving you benefits. But again, that will depend upon the model that the aggregator you're working with uses, right? Because they're not all the same. Yeah.
Great. Anything to add there, Sarah? That's very nuts and bolts. So I think that makes sense, Graham. Thank you. Krista's wondering, can you sign up for solar offsets a few years after your initial install? And I guess I would add to Krista's question, we have an installation. We just got an EV. We're going to upgrade our installation. Obviously, we kind of have this net zero dream because I'm a total dork, so I probably won't. But theoretically, theoretically, can I go for offsets on round 2 as long as it's not funded by those grants you're talking about? And also, as Krista says, can you do it years after your initial install?
Yeah, so as long as the initial installation, or rather not the installation, it's the date at which it started generating, was after that January 2nd of 2012, yes, you can. So if your system was installed in 2020, then you can start generating credits from when you sign up to a program. You can't go back in time and get the credits from between 2020 and 2022, but you can from 2022 onwards. You could sign up for the next 8 or 10 years or whatever and generate credits. As to the second part of your question, Heather, can you sign up for a second part of your system? Yes, you can, right? Provided it wasn't grant funded. So we've certainly spoken to people who initially installed, say, a 3 kilowatt system under one of the old grant funding programs. They've then installed another 5 kilowatts later on when they've been able to afford to do that. And so, they've essentially got 2 different systems, even though it's at one address. So yes, you can do that. Yeah.
So all these things are possible, but I guess I'll take that question to the next theoretical level. Sarah, how does that really impact this whole notion of additionality? The fact that we can do that. Would you say that those are things that the carbon offset protocols might someday change, or they might change that in the protocol because it's not necessarily proving additionality? Do you anticipate there's a future where that might happen, or what are your thoughts on that piece?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it, again, kind of comes back to what your goals are as far as what the rules for the offset program itself is. I don't know, I'm certainly not aware of any plans to kind of change that date. There is, if you look at companies that are purchasing renewable energy, they certainly have moved from, buying RECs from projects that exist to wanting to enter into contracts for new projects that really create a new solar array, for example, or a new wind farm. So certainly when you think about additionality, I would definitely, draw a line. And there is a difference between a project that exists already and, the decision that one made to generate or to go forward with that project. Obviously, you made that not planning to get credit for those offsets. So I think that is, it would be fair to say that those offsets are of lower quality from an additionality perspective. But once again, it goes back to, what are your goals? And if you want to be able to talk about being, generating your own low carbon power, then, that's not possible. And if it's really just about the economics side, then that is, a different question, and that you can still very much do under those rules.
Yeah, it's helpful to understand that. I think we have time for one more question in this format, and then I'm just going to ask everybody to think about your other questions. We're going to pull them over to the Zoom meeting room where you can actually ask them live, just because we wanted a little more interaction. But James has a question here that's about BC, and actually we have a lot of members. I would say I hear from folks fairly regularly who, they were in Alberta. Then when the government changed, they got nervous and left to BC. And now that they realize solar and carbon markets are still a thing, regardless of the government change, they're all coming back here, right? So we're having a lot of dialogue, interprovincial dialogue right now within our membership. And a lot of staff are having to cross borders just to staff up on different teams and everything. So lots of folks in the audience probably jumping between provinces right now. Wondering, what is the difference between the offset market in Alberta versus BC? Is there a pathway to have small scale solar offsets aggregated in BC?
Okay, that's an interesting one. The critical difference between Alberta and BC is that BC gets all its electricity essentially from hydropower. So there is, even if there's a mechanism to create offsets in BC, which there isn't right now at this level, you're basically not displacing anything. So you would be displacing clean hydropower with clean solar power. So that mechanism really doesn't exist in BC, and I don't really foresee that it could do either, right?
This is more unique to Alberta because we're still so heavily dependent on natural gas.
Absolutely. So
until recently on coal.
Yeah, exactly, right. So jurisdictions that have emissions intense grid, it makes sense. Somewhere in BC, perhaps in some of the more remote communities where they're still dependent on diesel generation. I know there's certainly a lot of the First Nations communities up on the coast, for example, where that is the case. So that there could be potential for those kind of communities, perhaps to electrify and claim offsets. But for your kind of lower mainland kind of communities that are connected to the grid, that's just not going to be a thing. Yeah.
So they've reached that point that we're trying to get to, where you actually don't really need that offset market to have a cleaner grid.
Quirk of geography, right?
Geography.
They have that luck to have lots of hydropower. We just don't, right?
Yeah,
so it's the way it goes, right?
Well, yeah. And Sarah, I guess further to that, I know there are some federal protocols, I think, in place. Do you know much about the federal component of it and whether that would be a factor in BC at all? Or?
Yeah, I don't believe so, because of the diversity across the provinces of the hydro rich and hydro poor provinces, there, as far as I know, are not federal protocols that allow for generation of offsets under the solar from solar generation. I mean, the one that I'm hesitant, because I feel like I have always behind on what's the latest in there, would be the clean fuel standard, and to whether or not there might be something within that space. The other, and I saw there was a question that popped up about Saskatchewan too. I think when it comes to looking outside of the compliance market, the voluntary market would be another space. And so, certainly I haven't heard of any in Canada, but there are some places in the world where corporations that are purchasing renewable energy are doing so from community projects. There's an interesting business case, I think, somewhere in Scandinavia, where one of the pharmaceutical companies bought renewable energy from a community-owned wind project there. So that would be a different, way to think about kind of tapping into some kind of offsets market. In this case, it would be a voluntary market. But I think Alberta, as Graham was saying, is pretty unique for being able to do this and sell those offsets.
And on that voluntary note, before we transition to the Zoom meeting room, I just want to assure everyone we are hearing and seeing questions about voluntary, and we couldn't cover everything today, but we are hoping to have another session down the road about the voluntary market, because I do think there are a lot of questions on that. And I realize that Graham's mostly working within the compliance market, so it's not the right time to ask every one of those questions today.